Okay, thank you. So yeah, my presentation is also in the context of the simulation of early vocal learning project. We just call it Evoclearn for short. And I'll specifically be talking about how we implemented goal-directed babbling in the project. So this is basically articulatory exploration of the vocal tract towards producing specific consonant vowel sounds. So, okay, so the structure of the talk, basically I have three parts with three specific intentions. So the first part, I will just briefly introduce the tools that we implemented in the project. And I'd like to kind of just show how this is implementing a form of vocal exploration, and which components are involved in this set of tools. And then I'd like to do a quick demonstration. So for anyone interested to understand how it may be practically used, I'll do a very quick demonstration to give a little bit more information about how we set up our experiments. And lastly, I have a few selected results from various studies over the past 3 years in this project that I'd like to share with you. So this is basically using our tools to simulate the babbling process. So those are the three parts of the process. So just a brief one-slide introduction. So the process that we're interested in simulating is vocal exploration. You can also call it babbling to some extent. And from the kind of observational literature, we know in real early vocal learning, this process has multiple phases. So it starts with experimenting with voicing control, the so-called phonation stage, where the learner produces only like resonating sounds. That goes on to a phase which usually happens 2 to 3 months old, where they start producing vowel-like sounds with some uncoordinated kind of obstruent sounds, especially in the back of the vocal tract. Then there's a stage where they really start exploring with different types of articulations. And this leads to the last kind of named stage called canonical babbling, which is associated basically after this, during and after this stage. The learner is able to produce syllables that can be perceived as kind of phonologically useful, and that's usually those syllables are kind of repeated, kind of reduplicated in reality. So in terms of computational work on this kind of process, many computational works consider this part of sensory motor learning, and it's often considered, at least the latter phases of this babbling process is often considered to be goal-directed. So the learner has some goal in mind during exploration, that they're trying to produce specific types of syllables, and gradually they explore the vocal tract until they are able to produce these sounds. So we implement this process, specifically this goal-directed babbling process. So this is kind of the later stages of babbling as an optimization process. So mathematically, it's an optimization process. And a large part of our work research in the last few years has basically been establishing what are the critical components and types of feedback required in this process to be successful at discovering CV and CCV syllables. So that's really been the goal of our work. So let me move on to introducing the kind of tools. So here is a kind of quick overview of one kind of experimental setup with our tools. So as I said, this articulatory exploration process is implemented as an optimization process. In this block diagram, it's essentially the central block diagram in the center of the slide. It implements basically a loop of articulatory space sampling, articulatory space, speech synthesis, and then we have some objective function. We're matching the produced speech some objective, so some goal that we're trying to produce eventually. So this is the main process, that's the central process that runs. And in our software, we implement this in a specific package called Evoclearn opt. And then we have two other software packages that implement the rest of the kind of environment necessary to implement the full simulation, which is basically, the example is this full slide here. So on the top, we have let's say the auditory part of the objective function. So the auditory objectives is at least the one way that we've done this is we've built a kind of auditory perceptual mapping. So this maps a sound to a kind of perceptual space that represents a syllable and the phonological aspects of a syllable, which can serve as a target for our optimization process. So one of the objectives is then the auditory objective. In our software, we implement this in a package called Evoclearn rec. And then the whole simulation is based on what we call Evoclearn core, which is basically the Python software that controls the vocal tract model. And of course, we are also using vocal tract lab for this. And this allows us to both do the speech synthesis, but also critically, we use the tube area functions to specify articulatory objectives. So the optimization process is dependent on both articulatory and auditory objectives in the end. And what we derive at the end is basically discovery of specific syllable gestures to produce CV sounds. Okay, so if I can quickly zoom in on the auditory objectives that we are able to simulate. So in our software, we can simulate two types of auditory objectives. One is basically acoustic matching, similar to what has been described. I think Yi and Sam described something like this, where it's possible to match the male-frequency cepstral coefficient, acoustic vectors, and other acoustic representations frame by frame. And if you have so basically the frame distance can be the auditory objective, or we can use our auditory perceptual mapping as the auditory objective. And this means that we can optimize for a specific vector that we define in terms of the auditory perceptual space, or we can reproduce specific utterances either through mapping it through the auditory perceptual encoder or through acoustic matching. And we have various ways of accounting for differences in the length of the audio and things like that. So this is the implementation of auditory objectives in this simulation. And then if I go to the bottom side of the figure, we have various ways to implement the articulatory objectives. So there are various types of articulatory objectives that are possible, and broadly they can be separated into three different categories. The first category is functions that act on the articulatory targets. So this is before we produce articulatory trajectories. Then we are able to produce specifications or constraints on the actual trajectory. So this would be something like making sure the tongue has touched the palate, so it kind of could simulate a tactile feedback. And lastly, we can specify an articulatory vector as an objective in the optimization process. And we have then functions based on the tube area that determine how well we're matching that objective. And so that can drive the optimization process forward as well. And so we can combine these two vectors and have basically an auditory, articulatory, perceptual vector that we are optimizing for to produce a specific CV. Okay, so this is the basic design of this process in terms of the simulation. And there are a number of advantages of the software. So firstly, the components that we use kind of standardize the components, inputs and outputs. It provides a kind of high-level composable way of setting up experiments. So it's kind of very easy to test different hypotheses. And the fact that we have like quite a modularized setup means that it's easy to run this either in the cloud or on your cluster. It's quite portable. So this is what we've been putting in a lot of effort to achieve with our tools. Okay, so then I'll move on to basically just quickly showing you how we can actually use this. So I've prepared a short demonstration on that. So let's move over to that. Yeah. Okay, so what I have here is a Python notebook, and I will go step by step through the process of how we could use this to set up a simulation of articulatory exploration. So one thing before we start is we will just import a few. Let me just clear all the outputs. Okay. So the first thing we do is we can just import some basic Python tools. These are all standard Python tools and some functions that we define for the demonstration. You can look at those perhaps at another time, and then we'll start. So in this demonstration, I'll just quickly show how can we install the Evoclearn tools and models. So we have some pre-trained models that we can use. How to define a syllable frame in this optimization process. So whether it be a CV, a CCV, and what are the nature of the different segments. So we'll quickly see how to define this. Then defining each of those objectives, the auditory and articulatory objectives. And finally, just how do we combine this all and run the actual simulation. So the software I described is on the standard Python package index. So in Google Colab, in the IPython notebooks, you can just pip install the software. And so I install opt, and there's another module called plot that just does some plotting, and it imports all that's necessary, including the core tools and Evoclearn. So the next step is to fetch a perceptual encoder. So we've pre-constructed or pre-trained what we call a CCV encoder, or a syllable encoder that's capable of recognizing CCV syllables. And with this code, I basically import the class from Evoclearn rec. I fetch the pre-trained model from our repositories, and I load it into memory here with this command. So now we have the auditory perceptual mapping loaded in here, and I will quickly load two audio samples and just show you what the evaluations are by this model. So I have loaded two samples, two CCV samples from our interspeech work. I don't know at which point I lost you, but basically we have the vector representations for those two sounds plotted here. So we can see we have two CCV sounds represented in the vector space. And the next thing that we do is we start to define the syllable frame. So the first step is to just load the speaker definitions from Vocal Track Lab. For Vocal Track Lab, we do the same. We just load it from the GitLab repositories. And it represents the optimization boundaries and also a neutral position for the Vocal Track Lab, which will serve as our initial conditions. Then to understand what we're doing here, basically we have three different types of parameters: the upper vocal tract parameters, the glottal parameters for the geometric glottis model that Peter mentioned, and then the target approximation parameters. So we have one each for the glottal and upper vocal tract that controls the rate at which the targets are reached, basically the trajectory speed of the process. So what we'll do for this demonstration is we are interested in optimizing to find the articulation for the CVB, and that's a voice plosive followed by a vowel. And we'll only try to find the vocal tract, upper vocal tract, and target approximation parameters, and we'll use the Vocal Tract Lab preset parameters for the glottis. So that's what we do in the next step. So there's a convenience function that basically gives us a default neutral vocal tract with a specific set of targets. In this case, they are for C and V, and we also preset the glottis targets for appropriate for the voice plosive and the modal voice. And let's quickly have a look. So we can look at the actual parameters. So you'll see for the vocal tract, both the C and the V initial position is the same, and you can see it in the plot as well below. But the glottis parameters on the right here are slightly different for the two types of voicing that we require. Okay, so this is our initial condition and basically defines the syllable frame that we're going to optimize for. Then we specify the actual parameters that we want to optimize. So of course, we can optimize the glottal parameters, but we stick to, for each the consonant. In this section, we define the consonant parameters, bounds that we want to optimize over, and which parameters and apply to which target, and then also the vowel at the bottom. So basically, these are just ranges for which the optimization is possible, exploration is possible. Then we define the auditory objective in terms of a vector that similar to what's necessary for the perceptual encoder. So for the CVB, for our CCV encoder, the first consonant is not present, so we use the silence representation. So then B and E are the two aspects that we're interested in. So we're basically defined the auditory objective here. For the articulatory objectives, we define two things. So the first thing is which of the predefined functions that use the tube areas we should apply, and to which target, so we're the consonant or the vowel. And then secondly, we specify the goal vector again for what we're trying to optimize for. So let's have a look how we define that here. So the articulatory specification here specifies which of the two targets this is applied to. We have a function name. So in this case, it's a function that looks at the tube area function to determine whether the vocal tract is open in general or closed. And then it's also possible, like I said, to specify a condition which, if it's not met, that basically the optimization process doesn't actually do the synthesis. So basically there's a time-saving short circuit condition that you're also able to specify. For the consonant, we also specify two other kind of regularization parameters, so regularization objectives. So one is to make sure that any closure has a very precise point in the vocal tract, so it's not a large closure over a large portion of the vocal tract, and that only one single articulator is performing a closure for the consonant. So yeah, so these functions will give us a 1 if that condition is met, or a 0 if it's not met. So all of these functions give us either a binary value for binary value, or a range between 0 and 1 in terms of how far the condition is met. For the vowel, we also use the tract open function, but we specify that the tract needs to be open. So we specified here that the consonant needs to have a closure, the vowel needs to have an open tract, and the consonant targets need to be precise and be a single closure. And at the end, those four values are represented in the vector as well, with values 0 and then 3 ones. Okay, so we've specified to the program what to apply and what the goal vectors are. Okay, and so the last part is just to combine all of this information and run the actual optimization. So we can do other things like change the weighting between articulatory and auditory objectives, specify what the maximum number of iterations are or synthesis attempts to perform, and other aspects like the metric and algorithm, and of course the seed if you want to reproduce specific ones. So we set those up, and then we create an optimization function with the speaker bounds, the optimization bounds, the articulatory goal, the auditory goal, the specifications, the auditory mapping that we imported earlier, the neural network, and then we basically run the optimization with our initial conditions, which is the neutral vocal tract. We specify the durations for the two segments, so it's 100 milliseconds and 400 milliseconds, and then we can run the optimization process. So if you look at the debugging output here, you can see that initially it explores a lot of basically vocal tract positions that do not satisfy the short circuit conditions for an open and closed vocal tract for a vowel and a consonant. But as soon as it finds one that satisfies those conditions, it actually performs synthesis and evaluates that also in terms of the auditory objective. So basically, there are two types of evaluation, one which is only based on the articulatory information, and if the basic conditions are met there, it combines the auditory and articulatory distances as the objective. So we specified this to run for at least 100 synthesis attempts. In this case, it runs for about 5 minutes. So I will just stop this, and hopefully our state is still saved from before. So let me just stop this for now. But basically what we get out is the best targets that are found from the optimization process. And we can now use the tools to actually look at the nature of those. So, okay, so everyone can see the screen again. I'm back. So now what we've done is we've just visualized the actual tube area functions for those two targets, for the consonant and the vowel. So we can confirm the vocal tract is closed at the lower lip, and then for the vowel, it's open. And then lastly, we can have a quick look at the actual dynamics. So we can plot the individual parameters. So you can see basically a target approximation process here. But we can also extract the kind of dynamic part, which we'll do in the next section, and then just visualize the actual transition. So let's just try and plot that one. Okay, so what we end up is, so what actually gets synthesized in the end is the actual dynamics here. So you can see, let me just do a reflect. So the lips basically open here. The tongue doesn't move much, but you can see the tongue sides kind of move slightly between the consonant and vowel section here. So this produces a BCV. And in this case, the random process learns something where the tongue doesn't move a lot, but of course that's not in this specific example. There are no articulatory specifications for co-articulation, but we can also add additional specifications that try and force co-articulation on the process as well. Perhaps a more efficient version would not move the tongue sides as much, but this articulation does satisfy the auditory and articulatory objectives that we have specified in this example. So one of the first experiments we did was we tested different auditory objectives. We tried acoustic matching versus this perceptual encoding. And as we expected, with a simpler acoustic matching, we do run into problems when we have a speaker mismatch. When we are trying to imitate a sound by a speaker that doesn't match the artificial speaker, then we have a drop in performance. So what we see on the right-hand side, is that we get better results if we have a speaker that produces a sound that we're trying to imitate that's a male speaker, or if we use the perceptual encoder. But if we have a female speaker, if we use the perceptual encoder, the recognition rate is still comparable, but it drops significantly if we use the acoustic matching as the auditory objective. And if we delve into the results there, we can see that certain types of vowels basically fail in the optimization process with the acoustic objective. Then a second thing we've tried, so another thing that we can do with the current setup is we are able to cascade the optimization process. So the example I showed you uses a kind of default initial condition, but you can also use the output of one stage of optimization as the input for a next stage. So we did some experiments with trying to find do articulatory exploration for CCV syllables. And we tried joint optimization of all of the parameters. We tried optimizing the vowel parameters first, followed by jointly the two consonants. Then we tried adding the consonants in different orders. So if the example of, for the example of clue, CCV clue, this is either joint, then it's basically like optimizing for U and then clue in the second stage, or U and then add the K, so ku, and then add the L, so clue in the third stage, or U, lu, and then clue. And we find that the best performing, or the easiest process, or the most successful process is when you jointly optimize the consonants. But it's also possible to first find the initial consonant on the basis of the vowel and then add the second consonant. But it is significantly less successful if you're trying to add the second consonant before the vowel and then the initial consonant after that. So that does suggest that kind of a dependence between the two consonant articulations as well, and that the specific order doesn't result in very good results on average. And then lastly, as I showed you, the example that we had, while it produces a sound that satisfies the auditory objective to produce something that sounds like B, it is possible that there is still some unnaturalness in the actual articulations that we find. So because our simulation doesn't take into account some physical and perhaps cognitive aspects of the learning process, we can account for that by adding additional articulatory goals to, let's say, prefer solutions that have more co-articulation. So we've done some experiments like on that, where we actually manually tie some of the parameters, and we've shown that that does improve the success rate at some point, but that adds prior knowledge to the process. Another way that we've experimented with is actually having a coefficient which measures the articulatory distance and then tries to have an objective of a low distance between, let's say, the consonant and vowel targets. And that has been quite successful at finding more co-articulated consonant or CVs and syllables. And it hasn't had much of an effect on the actual auditory aspect. So basically, we're still successful at producing naturally sounding syllables, but we're also finding solutions that are more natural in terms of co-articulation as observed in reality. So yeah, thank you for listening. So I just